Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, overdone introduction, but I'll try to live up to it. I'm calling my talk From Private Knowing to Public Knowledge, Scientific Confirmation of Remote Viewing, because one of the things that I've discovered when I talk with people is that there seem to be two camps. And I call these, the two camps, both pseudoscientists. People who know there's something there and people who know there's nothing there. What I would like to do is to get everybody to look at the evidence, look at the data, and then talk from that point of view. So what I want to talk about is how do we move from private knowing, whichever side the private knowing is, to public knowledge. And by the way, there's my website. As many of you know, and I'll talk about this later, I was part of the two-person team that reviewed the government data for Congress, and my report is actually still on my website. I put it up there shortly after that. So if you want to get the report, that's the website. I'm actually used to talking to academics where everybody puts themselves on a pedestal, so I'm not used to being up above the crowd. So I'm going to hand my transparencies to David here. He's going to put them up for me one by one. So I want to start by asking you to think about two questions. First question, what do you really know to be true, and how do you know it? What would you bet your life on as true? And in contrast, what do we all agree is true, and why do we agree that it's true? And I want to talk about moving from the top one to the second one. And here's just an overview of some of the things I think we know to be true and how we know them. So let's look at the two different ways. How do we know what we know? Well, there's private knowing and public knowledge. Private knowing, it's like Marcello said, he knows his family loves him. That's private knowing. I know I love my kids. I know ice cream tastes good to me. That's based on experience. Gut feeling. I know I've had past lives, some people will say. They're basing it on what they would call a gut feeling or just a knowing. I think we also take some of our private knowing from belief in experts. For instance, the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. I had feet per second. Shows what I know. I know there are 206 bones in the human body, at least most human bodies. What about public knowledge, though? How do we get that? Well, one way we get it is through shared experience and beliefs. Nobody's going to negate the fact that poison ivy causes a rash that itches, especially if they've had it. Okay? So we know that through shared experience. You can catch the flu from someone. People think that from their shared experience. We have physical and biological laws. The Earth rotates around the sun. People didn't always know that, but now we claim to know that as a group. Antibiotics kill bacteria. So these, again, are things that we've put together by studying them physically and biologically. And finally, what I'm going to talk about today, one way that we get to public knowledge is through statistical studies. For instance, there are millions of people who take aspirin because studies have shown that it helps prevent heart attacks. So those are the ways we get there. Okay, now I want to show you how science really works. This is a cartoon actually from Science magazine, which is the premier journal in science in the United States. In case you can't read it, it says, "Heard any good anecdotal evidence lately?" All right, and in fact, that is how much of science begins. People hear anecdotal evidence. So the question is, how do we move from anecdotal evidence to scientific conclusions? And here's a sort of a process. You have to start by creating testable hypotheses. You have to design suitable experiments to test those hypotheses. You have to analyze the results, and then you create new hypotheses based on those results. For example, as Marcello Truzzi mentioned, Ed May is now working on creating new hypotheses for how remote viewing might work based on some of the evidence from his earlier work. So that's the scientific process. Eventually, you accumulate sufficient evidence and explanation to provide new public knowledge. And much of that is done by using studies based on statistical methods. All right, so you're going to get a crash course in statistics here. How does statistics work, and why is it needed? Well, first of all, we don't need statistical methods to establish things in these two categories. to determine a relationship that holds every time, such as the blinking response to a wisp of air blown in your eye. We don't need statistics for that. Happens every time. We don't need statistics once a causal mechanism is understood, even if a relationship does not hold every time, such as trying to determine whether or not pollen causes hay fever or sex causes pregnancy. Those don't happen every time, but we know how they work. So I claim that right now, remote viewing, or whatever you want to call it, is in that in-between category where it doesn't happen every time, and we don't have a causal mechanism for it. And so it's a perfect area for where we do need or can use statistical studies. So when do we need statistical studies? Two things. One, to establish the existence of a relationship, an ability, etc., that does not occur every time or in every individual, and does not already have a causal explanation. For example, the relationship between taking aspirin and having a heart attack. That was established through statistical studies, and I'm going to show you that evidence as just an example of how this works. And the ability to score at higher than chance levels in what I'm calling telepathy experiments. By the way, I had to pick a term here. I just used the word telepathy because it's a term that even kids understand these days. In fact, the kids are amazing. I walked into my sister's house the other day, and my 4-year-old nephew had his Pokemon cards out. And his father, my brother-in-law, says, "Oh, you'll like this one, Jessica. It's this character has telekinetic powers." And my 4-year-old nephew said, "Dad, it's not telekinetic powers, it's psychokinetic powers." Secondly, to establish the average magnitude of these relationships and abilities. For instance, the use of aspirin daily seems to cut the rate of heart attacks almost in half compared to placebo. So that's the purpose of, those are actually two different statistical methods that I'm now going to tell you about. One to establish an effect, and the second one to look at the magnitude of the effect. So here's your quick lesson. Goals in statistics, the goal is to make conclusions about a population or about the state of nature based on observing a sample. Examples. Does aspirin reduce the risk of heart attack? Does something that we would call telepathy or whatever it is exist? And there are two common methods used in statistics. One is called hypothesis testing, and that's just to determine whether or not something exists. Yes or no? That's the kind of thing Marcello was talking about where you can make type 1 or type 2 errors. You can miss something that exists, or you can think something's there that doesn't exist. But hypothesis testing is set up to try to distinguish those. Secondly, confidence intervals. Those actually help you determine the magnitude of the relationship or the effect. By how much does aspirin reduce risk? How much more information than chance guessing can be achieved through remote viewing? And because information is only available from a sample, the precise magnitude can't be known. So we get an interval of values that we say, we call a confidence interval, and we say we're fairly confident that the truth lies in this interval. So now I'm going to show you just briefly how these two work. By the way, let me just take a big picture view for a minute and say, why should you care about this? Why should you care? You all think you know something. You have your private knowledge. Why should you care about moving to public knowing? Well, I would say there's two reasons. One, you have to be able to give a response to someone like Marcello Utts. Okay? You can't just say, well, I know it's real. You have to be able to say there's data, here's what the data says, this is what it means, I think. Secondly, I think it's really important that we move to public knowing with this stuff. I want to just give you an example. My partner had cancer surgery about 7 years ago, and I was sitting in the waiting room reading the Bernie Siegel book, Love, Medicine, and Miracles. And the physician, the surgeon, came out of the operating room, and he looked at me and he said, "What are you reading?" And I showed him, and he said, "Great book, but you won't need it." But you won't need it. Now, what was he saying? He was saying, what we already know, our established medicine can take care of this one, but if it couldn't, then you would need that book. Wouldn't it be great if every physician could respond that way? So that's what we want to move to, that kind of public knowing. All right, so back to the statistics lesson here. How does hypothesis testing work? Well, first of all, you set up two competing hypotheses. The null hypothesis, which says that there's nothing going on, no relationship, aspirin doesn't work to prevent heart attacks, and so on. And then what's called the alternative hypothesis, which is the one you'd actually like to be able to show, that something is actually going on. You collect data in such a way that if the null hypothesis is right, then you know approximately what to expect by chance. For instance, you would randomly assign people to take either aspirin or placebo, and you would expect about equal numbers of heart attacks in the two groups if aspirin doesn't work, right? Using the collected data, you find something called the p-value, and that's an important term to remember, by assuming the null hypothesis is true, and then asking how unlikely we would be to observe these results if that assumption was true, if nothing was really going on. How unlikely would these results be? And then you make a decision. If the p-value is really small, then you say, oh, we wouldn't be very likely to observe these results if there's nothing going on, if there's no relationship, if aspirin doesn't work. Therefore, it probably does work. We would conclude that the alternative hypothesis is actually correct. So it all hinges on this thing called the p-value, which says if there's nothing going on, how unlikely would we be to observe such extreme results? And here's a nice, classic, simple example of this. This is the classic physician's health study that first determined that aspirin actually does help to prevent heart attacks. And hopefully you can understand this pretty simple one. 22,000 physicians, healthy males, physicians who volunteered to be in the study. They were randomly assigned, half of them to take aspirin, half to take placebo, for 5 years. It was what's called double-blind, which means they didn't know what they were taking. The physicians who were monitoring them did not know what they were taking either. The null hypothesis was that the risk of heart attack would be the same after taking those two treatments, placebo or aspirin. The alternative was that the risk of heart attack would be lower after taking aspirin than after taking placebo. And here are the results. There were 9.4 heart attacks per 1,000 in the aspirin group, and almost double that, 17.1 in the placebo group. Now, maybe that could happen by chance. Maybe it just so happened that the people who were going to have heart attacks anyway ended up in the in the placebo group, and the people who weren't going to have heart attacks ended up in the aspirin group. That could be, right? So the question is, if chance is really the explanation, how unlikely would these results be? The answer, the p-value, 0.00001. So from that, we conclude the alternative hypothesis is true. The risk of heart attack is reduced when taking aspirin, because otherwise, if it were just chance, the data would be extremely unlikely. So when the p-value is small enough to rule out chance differences as an explanation with fairly high confidence, then we are led to believe the alternative hypothesis. The result is said to be statistically significant. This morning on CNN, I heard an advertisement for a new toothpaste, and it said, in clinical trials or clinical studies, it was shown to significantly reduce pain. It was for sensitive teeth. Significantly reduce pain. What they mean there by FCC regulations is that the results were statistically significant. Doesn't necessarily mean it was of any practical significance in terms of the amount of reduction, but that's what we mean by statistical significance. The p-value is small enough that we can rule out that there's equal reduction in pain in that case. All right, now I'm going to show you how confidence intervals work. The idea with a confidence interval is that you assume there's some unknown and unmeasurable true value of interest. For instance, what's the relative risk of having a heart attack after aspirin compared with placebo? Not just for these 22,000 men, but for the whole population. That's the question. Or, what's the probability of a correct response in a remote viewing task or telepathy test where you have, say, 4 choices? And I'm going to show you how these experiments work. You collect data for a sample of individuals, and then you use that data to estimate the unknown value and to create an interval of values that we're fairly confident covers the truth. And usually we create an interval that we're 95% confident covers the actual truth that's out there. For example, in the aspirin study, the relative risk of men was 0.55. Remember, you saw about half as many heart attacks in the aspirin group. If we create a 95% confidence interval, just taking into account the fact that there are going to be chance differences, just by chance, that interval goes from 0.42 to 0.67. In other words, the actual risk of a heart attack was, when you take aspirin, is reduced from somewhere between about a risk of about 0.42 times what it is with a placebo to about 0.67 or 2/3. So in the sample, the risk was about cut in half, but based on the uncertainty from just having a sample, we know the truth is somewhere covered by that interval. And by the way, chance is way out here. That would be an equal risk. A relative risk of 1 is chance. So it's clear that aspirin works to help reduce heart attacks based on this on this particular study. All right, now, Larry Dostie set me up beautifully for this. I'm going to go into more detail about this study that Elizabeth Targ and her co-workers did on the effects of distant healing on AIDS patients. As he said, it's too bad it wasn't 1988. Maybe we'd be farther along. 1998. This was published in the Western Journal of Medicine. To their credit, they tried very hard to get it into a traditional medical journal and were able to do so. There were 40 volunteers with advanced AIDS. They were matched by age and level of illness so that they were done in pairs. They had, in the original study that they did, it just turned out by chance that the people who were in the control group actually had been sicker or older or different to begin with. So this time they took an even further methodological step to ensure that they wouldn't be criticized, and that is they matched these patients. One from each pair was randomly assigned to receive distant healing for 10 weeks, and I'll call that the DH group, and the other was assigned to a control group, the C group. It was double blind, so neither the patients nor the physicians knew who received the healing treatment. And the healers were only given photographs. They never met the patients. And the healers were throughout the United States. They were people who were self-identified as healers from a variety of healing traditions. Now that you know all about statistics, you can interpret these results. You can understand these results as I show you them. The distant healing subjects, after 6 months, had acquired fewer new AIDS-defining illnesses, which is a specific list of illnesses that go with AIDS. It was 0.1 versus 3.6 on average per patient. P-value of 0.04. In other words, if there really were no difference in the population, we'd see that difference in the sample only with probability 0.04. Okay? Distant healing patients had fewer doctor visits. And remember, it's double blind. They didn't know they were being prayed for or having distant healing. 9.2 versus 13 doctor visits. P-value 0.01. Distant healing subjects had fewer days of hospitalization, 0.5 versus 3.4, p-value of 0.04. Distant healing subjects showed significantly improved mood compared to the control subjects. In a profile of mood scores that was a psychological inventory that they used, 26 versus 14, p-value of 0.02. Okay? So, moving from anecdote to scientific evidence in this area, what do we conclude? Statistically significant effects in this study. Now granted, it's one study, it's enticing, but it's not enough. We need additional studies. I'm happy to report Elizabeth has been funded for an additional study, so this work is moving forward. We also need possible causal explanations, and that's beyond statistics, so I can't help you there. At least not today. All right. So now, as I said, it's one study, and of course any one study can be criticized. So let's go back to how we, move it up a little bit, okay? How we move from anecdotes to scientific conclusions, revisited. Okay, we go through these things that I said earlier, create testable hypotheses, need to know what would happen by chance, design suitable experiments using carefully controlled conditions like double-blind procedures in medical studies, no chance for ordinary communication in remote viewing studies. We analyze the results to those expected by chance, find p-values, and find confidence intervals. But here's a key. One study is not enough. We have to look at replications. That's how science works. It's not enough to just do a single study, no matter how good the p-value is. So now I want to move into the realm of showing you how you look at a body of scientific evidence. And I'm going to start with a non-controversial area, and then I'm going to move into the remote viewing work. And I'm going to go back and forth here. So this is a different set of studies on aspirin. This is for people who'd already had a heart attack or a stroke. Set of studies were analyzed together in what's called a meta-analysis this wasn't actually in 1988. There were 25 different studies on the recurrence of heart attack or stroke when patients were treated with aspirin. The outcome of interest was called the odds ratio, which is just the odds of having a recurrence of a heart attack or stroke with aspirin compared to with a placebo. And by chance, we would expect that odds ratio to be 1. Here were the combined results. There were 25 overall studies, 13 for stroke, 10 for heart attack, 2 other. The number with a p-value less than 0.01 was very small. Okay? Most of the studies did not achieve this so-called statistical significance. There were only 5 out of the 25 that did. But when they looked at the overall combined results, the odds ratios were much below 1. In fact, the overall odds ratio was 0.75. So there was a 25% drop in recurrence of heart attacks and strokes when taking aspirin. And yet, if you looked at the individual studies, most of them were not convincing. They were not statistically significant. So what do you do in a case like this? Well, you look at the stuff together, and I always like visual pictures. I like pictures better than numbers, even as a statistician. So here's a picture of the combined data for those studies. Each one of these represents a confidence interval. Now that you all know what a confidence interval is, you can interpret these, right? So these are all the different studies listed, the 25 studies. And I want to point your eyes to this little purple line down there. That little purple line is the combined confidence interval for all of the studies. The green line up and down here is an odds ratio of 1. That's chance. The red line is the 25% reduction that on average they found for the studies. Now notice, almost all the studies cover chance, the green line. But when you combine all that data, you get that tiny little purple line down there. It doesn't come anywhere near the chance line. So that's clearly convincing evidence, not from any single study, but from all the studies combined. That's the replication issue. All right, so now how does this apply to remote viewing? Well, I'm going to jump into Stargate here, and you probably heard other things about Stargate. This is my little perspective on Stargate, because I'm going to tell you what I was asked to do and what I did. Stargate is basically the last in a series of names that were given to classified special access U.S. government programs dealing with, and this is a list from what we were given when I did my review for them, collection and assessment of foreign work in parapsychology, and this is just from Ed May's report. Operational remote viewing, which I'm sure all of you have heard a lot more about even than I have. Threat assessment, in other words, are we in danger from other countries trying to give our president a heart attack or whatever? And then finally, research. Especially from 1985 forward, the research that we were given was focused on that era, and it was done at SRI and at a company called SAIC. Okay, so in the summer of 1995, Ray Hyman, who's a psychologist at the University of Oregon, and I were tasked to do a review. But we were only tasked to do the review of the scientific work, the work that had been done at SRI and SAIC. We were sent 3 boxes of material from those labs, and we were given almost no operational remote viewing material. So it was just the scientific stuff. We had a 2-fold charge: determine the extent to which psychic functioning has been established, determine if it's useful for intelligence work. Notice a little bit of a disconnect. We weren't given any of the operational remote viewing stuff. And in fact, we were told not to talk to anybody who'd done the operational remote viewing stuff. And we were told that we were supposed to focus on the government programs only, that we were not supposed to include research at other laboratories, except to show external validity, and we were supposed to concentrate on the experiments at SAIC because of the time constraint. We were given like a 2-month period to do this. Now, you can't answer questions about usefulness under those conditions, number one, and I, as a statistician, can't establish a scientific effect using only 1 or 2 laboratories. That's just not how it works. So I sort of ignored what they told me to do. And I looked at the data from SRI, SAIC, and then a bunch of other Gansfeld data. So I just want to now give you a real brief overview of remote viewing in Gansfeld. I'm sure most of you know all about this, at least the remote viewing part, but you might not know the Gansfeld stuff. So this is just the example of a protocol for a single laboratory remote viewing session from SRI, the SRI days. 10 o'clock, remote viewer and monitor are sequestered in a laboratory room. I don't know, maybe Russell, maybe you wrote this originally. I got this from Ed May. 10:05, an assistant uses a computer to randomly select 1 target from a large set. 10:15, the session begins. The viewer draws and or writes, trying to see the target, and has already been locked away in the room, so has no way to know what it could be. Session ends. The raw data is copied and secured. Copy is provided to the viewer for some sort of at least psychological feedback. And then the feedback of the actual target is provided to the viewer, but the judging is actually done in the government work by an independent judge. So later, an independent judge who hasn't seen any of this stuff takes the remote viewing transcripts and the possible targets and tries to determine which of the possible targets the remote viewer was trying to describe. Sometimes the target's not chosen until after the session. Sometimes the sender is looking at the target. So those are just slight deviations. The Ganzfeld setup is what's used in a number of other laboratories. And here's how you can see that the picture at the bottom is why I'm in statistics and not art. This is my little rendition here of how the Ganzfeld works. And the picture on the top is actually from a Journal of Parapsychology article written by Charles Honorton and his colleagues, showing how the experimental setup was done so that there couldn't be any kind of cross-communication using normal means. Okay, so here's how the Ganzfeld works. Unlike remote viewing where you're actually drawing, in the Ganzfeld you can't draw because you have these little half ping pong balls taped on your eyes. So that's what those little bulges are there in the front. And then you have headphones on, and you're listening to what's called white noise, which is like a train or an ocean or whatever. It's like static. So that's the headphones there. And you're in a chair that's much more comfortable than the one I've drawn here, actually like a recliner chair. And then you have a red light being shown at your face. And so all you're seeing, your eyes are open, and you're seeing this field of red light, and you're hearing this random noise. And I think the idea is supposed to be that your brain is getting input, but it's not any meaningful input. So hopefully what your brain will do, or whatever it is that's getting this, is go over to where the sender is and try to get the information that the sender is sending. Sender's in another room looking at a television screen. And the television screen has the target on it. And in some of these Ganzfeld experiments, the target is just a still photograph, and in some of them it's a video clip playing repeatedly. And if you want to see a summary of the work that had been done up until that point anyway, 1994 Psychological Bulletin, an article by Darrell Bem and Charles Honorton, reviews a lot of the work up to that point. Here's an example of how a Ganzfeld session works. It's very similar to a remote viewing session until you get to the judging part. Target is randomly generated from a pre-designed pool. A response is generated, usually 15 to 30 minutes of talking. 4 target possibilities are then shown to what they call the receiver in these experiments. So this is where it deviates from the remote viewing work that was done at SRI and SAIC in that it's not an independent judge. The person who's actually been doing the description also does the judging. So they're shown 4 choices. They're supposed to rank them from 1 to 4. And if they get the right one, in other words, one of those 4 is the one they were actually supposed to be trying to describe. If they get the right one, it's called a direct hit. It's a rank of 1. So here's an example, an actual target. I actually went to the Coca-Cola plant and got this target. It was a Santa Claus, a picture of Santa Claus with a Coke bottle, and I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, but I have a description of it here. So the idea would be that there's this target that's been picked randomly from 4 choices. Let's say these are the 4 choices. The person is supposed to be trying to describe what they think the sender is looking at. They give their description, then they're shown these 4 choices. And they have to pick, okay, which one do you think you were just trying to describe? Okay? And if they get it right, it's called a direct hit. And when you see this description, you'll see why they got it right. And then there's an analysis done for the entire experiment, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So this is just a brief description of one example. And it's from a paper in the Journal of Parapsychology by Charles Honorton. The description of the target, this is a Coca-Cola Christmas ad from the 1950s showing Santa Claus holding a Coke bottle in his left hand. 3 buttons are visible on Santa's suit. Behind Santa and to his left is a large bottle cap with the Coca-Cola logo leaning against an ornamental Christmas tree. And here's part of what the person said when they were in this crazy state. There's a man with a beard and he's got a sharp face. There's another man with a beard. Now there's green and white and he's in bushes and he's sort of colonial. He looks like Robin Hood and he's wearing a hat. I can see him from behind. I can see his hat and he has a sack over his shoulder. Window ledge is looking down and there's a billboard that says Coca-Cola on it. There's a snowman again and it's got a carrot for a nose and 3 black buttons coming down the front. There's a white beard again. There's a man with a white beard. There's an old man with a beard. Yeah, pretty good, okay? So you can see why that would be scored a direct hit. So I already showed you how the original session works. And then the analysis for an entire experiment would be to use the number of direct hits, and the probability of a hit by chance alone would be 0.25. And this is in statistics what we call a binomial experiment, sort of like rolling dice. Okay, so by chance, you know what should happen, 25% chance of getting it right. And so we can compute a p-value and a confidence interval by looking at the actual number of direct hits and comparing that to the 1/4 that we would expect by chance. Now, the original set of Gansfeld studies that got everybody sort of interested in using them were done in the 70s and early 80s. And this is a picture, like the aspirin picture that I showed you, for the results of those studies. The best estimate for the overall proportion of direct hits was 0.38. Chance is 0.25. The individual studies, many of them covered chance, although not as many as in the aspirin example, you can see. But when you combine the results, there's a confidence interval. That's the confidence interval for the true probability of a direct hit based on these studies. Notice it doesn't go anywhere near chance. Okay, now these studies were justifiably criticized for some methodological flaws, and so replications were done. That's what the Psychological Bulletin article talks about, is some of those replications. And by the time we came along in 1995 to do our report, our Stargate report, there had been a number of other replications of Gansfeld studies. So what I did, as I told you, is I ignored their instructions to just look at the SRI and SAIC experiments, and I looked at the remote viewing experiments done at SRI, SAIC, and then the Gansfeld studies that had been done at a number of laboratories over the years, and then most recently the ones that had been done just before I did my study. This is just one, this is directly out of my report. I just wanted to show you, this is one analysis that I did, which was to look directly at the SAIC experiments that they asked us to look at, and to look at the p-values for each one. Now, you can see that some of them have p-values that are in the range where we call the results statistically significant. Some are wildly statistically significant, 9.1 times 10 to the minus 8th. But occasionally, there were studies that weren't statistically significant. Okay, just like in the aspirin study. By the way, MCE just means mean chance expectation, which means that you didn't get anything that deviates from what you would expect by chance. But when we looked at the data combined, I'm going to do again the numbers and then the visual. This is a list of all of the different studies and combinations of studies that I looked at. Here are the remote viewing studies, SRI, SAIC. SRI remote viewing studies, there were 966 trials. P-value was 4.3 times 10 to the minus 11th. That's 0 for all practical purposes. Hit rate was 34% when you expect 25% by chance. And a confidence interval was from 31% to 37%. At SAIC, same kind of thing. P-value of essentially 0, okay, 5.7 times 10 to the minus 7th. Confidence interval for the hit rate went from 31% to 39% when you'd expect 25% by chance. Same thing with all the Gansfeld studies. Occasionally you would see one that covered chance. Here's one. Just barely covered chance. Here's another one. P-value was only 0.15. Okay, but you can see the consistency of results. Confidence intervals basically spanning the high 20s to low 40% hit rate when you'd expect 25% by chance. Here's a picture of it. Same kind of picture, and what I've done here is lump together all the SRI, SAIC trials together, and then the early Gansfeld, and then PRL, which was the Psychophysical Research Laboratory. That was the one where I showed you the elaborate setup. And so on, all these other laboratories doing Gansfeld work, and there is a little combined confidence interval for the hit rate. Again, nowhere near chance. So, despite what Marcello says, in my conclusion to the Stargate review, what I said is, using the standards applied to any other area of science that uses statistics, it's concluded that psychic functioning has been established. I believe it would be wasteful of valuable resources to continue to look for proof. Resources should be directed to the pertinent questions about how this ability works. In other words, now this is not a direct quote anymore, but I think these studies are numerous enough, robust enough, and consistent enough in their results that we can rule out chance as an explanation. Something is going on that isn't explained by our current public knowledge. I don't quite know what that is yet. Okay, so now let's go to sociology here for a minute. Let me tell you some things about the aspirin studies that I showed you. These are direct quotes from the article that summarized them. First, the trials were very heterogeneous, including a range of ages, a range of different diseases, a range of treatments, and so on. One of the arguments the skeptics use is, well, wait a minute, what is psi? It's a whole bunch of different things. So is this. 2, though such risk reductions might be of some practical relevance, however, they are surprisingly easy to miss even in some of the largest currently available clinical trials. If, for example, such an effect exists, then even if 2,000 patients were randomized, there would be an even chance of getting a false negative result. That is, failing to achieve convincing levels of statistical significance. Okay, so in other words, yeah, if you do small studies, you're not going to get statistically significant results, even if something really exists. So the fact that you don't get statistically significant results every time is not a reason to discount an area. The main results were obtained from the principal investigators in most cases. Parapsychologists would be slaughtered for doing something like this. In some trials, the data obtained differed slightly from the data originally published. Okay? Huh. The final meeting of collaborators was supported. You think only proponents are doing psi research? Look at this. The final meeting of collaborators was supported not only by the United Kingdom Medical Research Council and Imperial Cancer Research Fund, but also by the Aspirin Foundation and a bunch of pharmaceutical companies. And finally, there were no controls. What was to prevent one of those guys from taking the pill to his local chemist and having it analyzed? You would never get away with that in a parapsychology experiment. So now let's go back to my conclusion and let's compare it to the aspirin. Remember, millions of people are taking aspirin. Using the standards applied to any other area of science that uses statistics, it's concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. So how are the remote viewing and Gansfeld results different from the aspirin in prevention of strokes and heart attacks? Well, they're different in a number of ways. Number one, if the same standards are applied, the anomalous cognition results are much stronger. Number two, the aspirin studies had more opportunity for fraud and experimenter effects than the anomalous cognition experiments. 3, the aspirin studies were at least as frequently funded and conducted by those with a vested interest in the outcome. And 4, in both cases, the experiments were heterogeneous in terms of experimental methods and subjects. So why are millions of heart attack and stroke patients taking daily aspirin, but science still doesn't accept anomalous cognition? Okay, well, I'm going to leave you with a list of stages from Dean Radin's great book, The Conscious Universe. Page 1, here's how he starts. Acceptance of new ideas in science follows a predictable 4-stage sequence. In stage 1, skeptics confidently proclaim that the idea is impossible because it violates the laws of science. In stage 2, skeptics reluctantly concede, whoops, left out an E, that the idea is possible, but that it's not very interesting and the claimed effects are extremely weak. A mere anomaly. That's where we are right now with the scientific community. Stage 3 begins when the mainstream realizes not only that the idea is important, but that its effects are much stronger and more pervasive than previously imagined. I think we're headed there. I think we're almost there. Okay? And finally, number 4, stage 4 is achieved when the same critics who previously disavowed any interest in the idea begin to proclaim that they thought of it first. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's it. I think I have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yes?
What was the, when you went back to the government, I guess you were tasked by the government to do the initial study on Stargate, or at least to have it. When you went back and said, okay, this is what we found, what was the response?
The question was, when I went back with my Stargate review and said, this is what we found, what was the government response? If you read the report carefully, the AIR report, what it says in there is that there is some sort of anomaly in the data. Everybody agrees with that, but that they don't think it's useful for intelligence work. So they never addressed the question of whether or not there was actually psychic functioning or something that we would call that going on. But they acknowledged there was an anomaly in the data, a mere anomaly, but said that they didn't feel like at this point it was strong enough or useful enough for intelligence work. Russell?
Have you published this inspiring comparison of aspirin studies and ESP studies?
Have I published this inspiring comparison? I'm embarrassed to say that I don't even know if I've published it directly in this form. I've certainly talked about it and used the analogy. Most recently, I published something in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which talks about how science proceeds and that sort of thing. And some of it's in there, but I can't remember how much it's in there.
This would be a wonderful paper. I suggest that you write it up.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Would you please project the Anson address again?
Ah, yes. The very first transparency had my web address. And by the way, if you forget it or don't have something to write it down with, if you find the web page for UC Davis, which is www.ucdavis.edu, and go to departments, you'll get to statistics, and then I don't know who Anson is or what that is, but that's our department server, anson.ucdavis.edu. And if you even get that far, you just click on faculty and you'll find my home page. Okay. Okay. Okay, I think it's time to move on. I think since your stomachs haven't learned to live on non-local time yet, I think we better move on to the last speaker before lunch.